Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. I'm David Suddjian, and tonight we're talking about Colorado blues. We're going to be talking about our bluebirds. And we have Laura Stedman assisting tonight, as usual, to help with our questions and answers and any chat. And so at the end, we'll have a little time for some questions. So please fire away, and Laura will help us with that at the end. So, you know, the lark bunting is Colorado's current state bird. And the lark bunting is a great bird. Now, we're still about 2 months away from when lark buntings are going to be coming into our area, but it's a great bird, but it's got its shortcomings as a state bird. First thing is, it's only here for 5 months out of the year in Colorado. I mean, strictly speaking, a little bit longer, but mostly about 5 months. And it's really only in the eastern third of the state. And for most of us, you have to go out of your way to go and enjoy lark buntings, except maybe like along the Front Range a little bit during migration, there's a certain window. But, you know, as important as the lark bunting is for DFO, I think it's time that we consider a new state bird for Colorado. Now, I'm not the first one to propose this, but this is one of my themes for tonight. The bluebirds are amazing birds. The mountain bluebird would be a better state bird for Colorado. So, you know, we don't have to be shy here. Other states have done it. We have already 2 states with mountain bluebird as their state bird, Idaho and Nevada, and Colorado could join in. We could have a trifecta of mountain bluebird strength. We've got eastern bluebird states, Missouri and New York. And it's okay if the states, if there's a lot of states that have the same state bird. I mean, look at the cardinal. So we could do this. And I think if we kind of band together, one day we'll see the mountain bluebird as a great symbol for our state. And maybe it won't be the pretty boy. Maybe it'll be the more subtle female that'll be up there on the flag. You know, it could be. So one day, it's starting here on Bird Bombs tonight. Bird Bombs was instrumental in getting the uncolored lark bunting kicked out to make way for a truly more worthy bird to take its place in full living color. So we're going to continue this beginning of the campaign with a little celebration of the mountain bluebird, because this is a Colorado bird par excellence. And I think it's the most beautiful bluebird. Okay, this is like, you know, what can you say? All of them are absolutely gorgeous, but the mountain bluebird is one that you can read about it as the most beautiful bird. I love these various quotes, mostly from some older texts, but one that's not quite so old from David Gaines here in the top center area. I'm going to read it for you. Though they lack the dulcet songs of other thrushes, I fancy the mountain bluebird the loveliest of all Sierran birds. As they hover over the meadows or glide to perches atop rocks or trees, their delicate grace lifts the heart. The sun catches their plumage, turning it bluer than the mountain sky above. They are not merely birds, they are feathered epiphanies. Isn't that beautiful? Feathered epiphanies. So mountain bluebird is a super gorgeous bird that we get to enjoy really all year round in Colorado if you go to the right places. But now coming into this season here, as we're getting into spring, they're moving into the state in a big way. And so here we have our 3 focal species, our 3 bluebirds. These are in the order Passeriformes, the perching birds. They're in the thrush family, Turdidae. So they're with robins, solitaires, thrushes like hermit thrushes, varied thrush, some others. And they're all in the same genus, Cyalia. All right, so it's pronounced Cyalia. Can you repeat it with me? Cyalia. That's pretty good. And so notice as in the pictures I have here, I've got the mountain arranged on the left and the western in the middle and the eastern on the right. And so I'm going to be consistent with that all the way through the main part of our show until we get to the quiz. So you always know where you're at. These are thrushes, and they share a lot of characteristics with the other members of the thrush family. One I'll just point out right now is the spotted juvenile plumage is a feature we see on the bluebirds and on other thrushes. It's really beautiful, and it's a distinctive thing for thrushes. So bluebirds, their gorgeous plumage is made blue by feather structure, not by pigment. So that's different from a lot of colored birds. And bluebirds are not the best songsters. So they don't have great songs like robins and hermit thrushes and some of the others, the Townsend solitaire, but they have more subtle songs and more chirpy kinds of calls. They can be identified by their vocalizations. It's more challenging. A beautiful thing is to be out in bluebird nesting habitat before sunrise. They start to call at just the first light, and they're calling maybe in different directions if you're in a good spot. And it's this beautiful fabric of bluebird calls at that wonderful time of the morning. So bluebirds nest in open settings with trees or some other cavity source. They don't make their own cavities like woodpeckers, but they need to get a cavity provided, either a natural cavity in a tree or something made by a woodpecker, or a bluebird box, for example, or even some other kind of structure or other place where they find a spot. So bluebirds like to forage in open areas. They perch on exposed branches, on wires, on fence posts. They hover in the air, and they drop down onto the ground for invertebrate prey. That's mostly invertebrate insectivorous prey during the breeding season. Fruit is an important part of their diet at other times of the year, and juniper berries are really an important natural food source. So they gather in flocks when they're moving, and during the winter time, but in nesting season, they'll start to pair out, and we'll just see twos eventually. But for now, as we start to encounter them in the season, we're going to encounter a lot. So bluebirds generally like open settings. So I've got a little array of some beautiful Colorado landscapes here. And if you look for kind of common threads, what you can see is that there are some trees, and they have edges. There's edge habitat, right? So we've got some short grassland stuff. There's some structures in one of the pictures. I see ponderosa pines prominent in two of the images here, and some snags and looks like willows or something up in here, a higher mountain setting, and here down a prairie setting. So common theme, open setting, short grass cover, woodland edges with some kind of a cavity available. We'll look a little more detail here at the three species. So the mountain bluebird has the broadest elevational range of the three in Colorado. When we think about their breeding habitat, their breeding range, they go all the way from down around 5,000 feet up to tree line, like 11,500, and above that, where they can find suitable cavities. And so you see them in wide open habitats, as long as there's something where they can nest. When I took this picture here, that's my son Stephen there in the foreground. When I took this picture, there was a pair of bluebirds nesting in a crevice in this building. This is up at Boreas Pass. All the way down from there at that Alpine Pass down to the hogbacks at Kent Carroll is mountain bluebird country. And so the western bluebird here in the middle, you can see one common thread in these three pictures, and that's the ponderosa pine. The western bluebird is a great indicator species, one of the most characteristic species of the ponderosa pine habitat, perhaps along with the pygmy nuthatch as really characteristic. And they also like pinyon juniper habitat and some riparian areas. But the ponderosa pine is where they're the most abundant and, as I say, very characteristic. And unlike the mountain and the eastern bluebird, the western bluebird really doesn't particularly favor large open areas or margins to the degree the other two do. So when you look at the eastern bluebird images on the right, we see that we're talking about riparian habitat. And that's their classic situation in eastern Colorado, is some kind of a cottonwood willow riparian forest, often kind of open with some large trees. Now they have nested in some other types of forest close to the Front Range edge, ponderosa pine and oak scrub. So the key is that you got to have a hole, and the bluebirds find those holes in snags, dead trees that are left standing, and snags are happen naturally in forests as trees get old or things happen to them, and woodpeckers build their holes in snags especially, and those become bluebird holes. And forest fires also provide a great snag source for bluebirds in some situations. And of course, nest boxes are a great resource, providing those cavities. And you know, you look at this landscape on the lower right here, and it's an open sage habitat in Gunnison County. And this is great bluebird habitat, great mountain bluebird habitat. But in this picture, there's no nest cavities, and there's maybe no pair of mountain bluebirds for quite a while until you can find a spot where somebody has put up a nest box or some kind of thing, fence post perhaps is making a structure, and a little aspen grove, something out there. So those open countries are fantastic habitat, but they need to have the nest resource. So now we're heading into springtime. It doesn't look green here yet at all, but it will in just a few weeks. It'll get green, and there's going to be some lovely days, and bluebirds are going to be moving north towards their breeding range here in Colorado and further north. And they don't go up into the mountains too much right away, but they will pause, and then they'll start to go up, but then blammo, there's going to be a little interruption in spring, and we're going to get 8 inches of snow, a foot of snow in April, in May. This picture was taken on Mother's Day in May, about 2014, I think it was. It's a great migrant fallout. Can be great for birds, because what happens, birding rather, not necessarily the birds, what happens is the birds get a little bit desperate and they cannot find the food they need in a lot of the normal areas they might be searching. So in the case of the bluebirds, they get forced down out of the mountains, and a lot of times they'll congregate in areas along edges of water, whether it's lakes, reservoirs, larger rivers and streams, because that's where insects are active. And so when the snowy times happen, bluebirds get pushed back down out of the mountains all of a sudden for a while and go look for them in those kinds of situations. It can actually be kind of sad, because it can be a stressful time for them, but it's a natural part of what happens every year. Some storms happen and push them around. So they try to advance, but they get kind of slowed down really until late May, when they can make a firm foothold up in the higher mountain areas. So as we go on to look at our bluebirds, let's take a little short review. Where's that on the bluebird? Okay, so our last bird bombs was all about the names of bird parts and what we're looking at in different things. So let's take advantage of what we learned then and kind of look again at some of these features on bluebirds. So first thing is the 3 sets of flight feathers, the primaries, secondaries, and tertials, and you can see how they're arrayed. The primary is on the outer part. In the bluebird case, they have 10, but you only can count 9 because one of them is very short and reduced. So there's 9 primaries showing, and then there's going to be 6 secondaries and 3 shorter tertials tucked up back up here. We can see some of the body features here on this left-hand bird, and on the other bird that's to the right of it, the sides and flanks and the undertail coverts, and then the breast, belly, and undertail coverts again. So bluebirds have 12 rectrices, or tail feathers, and 6 on either side. There's the 2 in the middle right there. And so these have open wings. We can see primaries, secondaries, and tertials. Now on these closed wings, remember that some of these feathers fold underneath the other ones. So the primaries fold underneath the secondaries, which are folded underneath the tertials. So that's how that plays out on that closed wing. Just look at some of those again, and here we can appreciate some of these coverts, primary coverts, secondary coverts, the alula right here. All right. All right, so let's take a look at our 3 species here now in a little more detail, and we'll begin to parse them out. So we already have taken a look at habitat, and we'll maybe consider that a little bit more, but let's consider the distributions of these 3 species. So status and distribution is the what, when, where, and why. And this is the important framework that lets you really become informed on what to expect when you're trying to find and identify birds. So we can see that the mountain bluebird on the left-hand side here basically has a broad Great Basin and Rocky Mountain distribution. And in Colorado here from the Breeding Bird Atlas 2, we see it basically occupying the western 2/3 of the state, with some incursions out here along the Palmer Divide and some presence here and some PJ habitat down in Los Animas and neighboring counties. So the mountain bluebird is widely distributed in the state, and at this time of year, they are even more widespread because they are all over the place in migration, really. Actually, will be out on the prairie during the spring migration and in the fall, even before they get up into the mountains. So mountain bluebird. And the western bluebird, look, it's a little more localized. It doesn't occur all over the place like the mountain bluebird does up in the western region of the state, but it's more centered along the general Front Range margin and those whole mountain regions through here, and then in the southwest part of the state. And you can kind of think, why is that? Remember I said that ponderosa pine is a really important feature for western bluebirds. And here's a forest map, and the red areas are the ponderosa pine dominated forests. And so notice how well that aligns with the western bluebird distribution. Very, very close relationship there for that habitat and that species. Now, the eastern bluebird is really a prairie bluebird, and this is a map for the June and July period over all of eBird's history. So it has a lot of different dots piled up. The areas where they're most regular are along some of the stream corridors in the prairie region of the state. and then locally along the Front Range edge. So a very different distribution from the other species. So when you're considering identification, for the most part, when you're out on the prairie, like really on the prairie, not near the metro area here, because that's close to the Front Range. Well, you're out there, it's eastern versus mountain mostly. Little window in migration that western's possible, but prairie-wise, eastern versus mountain. And in the mountains, in the western part of Colorado, it's mountain versus western. The eastern is a rarity there. Not totally to be ruled out, but not something you expect. But then along the Front Range region, all the way down to the Pueblo region, Fremont County, it's mostly mountain versus western, but all three are possible, and the eastern is regular in some areas. So those are a little more challenging areas for bluebird ID. Take a brief look at seasonal occurrence in Colorado. We can see that just looking at the left-hand graph here, this is our metro and the near Front Range edge counties. So not getting up too far up into the mountains. And we see that the eastern bluebird, this little blue line along the bottom, is pretty much a non-breeding season presence in our metro Front Range area, and a very low presence at other times. But the mountain bluebird in green and the western bluebird in red are much more frequent and also more numerous. We see that when we look at numbers, the mountain bluebird here on our abundance graph is more numerous by far than the western bluebird at these times of migration when they're passing through. The mountain bluebird has a lot of range to fill in north of Colorado, and a lot of birds pass through Colorado heading further north. But once we get to the breeding season, the two numbers are not that dissimilar. If we get up into the mountains, as we'd expect, the mountain bluebird is more common than the western. The eastern is not represented there. Out on the far eastern prairie, we see the mountain has a migratory pattern and is missing during the breeding season. All right. So let's take a look at our three gentleman bluebirds here. And we've got the boys are blue. So we've got adult males featured. And one of the things we can begin to look at is the color difference. And we're going to see in a little bit how the color brightness can vary during the time of the year. It also varies with different individuals. Like for the mountain bluebird, for example, some are brighter blue or a deeper blue than other individuals, but there's a seasonal change as well. But the mountain bluebirds, I like to think of it as a sky blue. So it's a light blue, it's a Colorado sky blue. When you're up there in the mountains and the thing is perched on a fence post with sky in the background, you can hardly see the bird, okay? It is sky blue. The western bluebird is a deeper blue, and the eastern bluebird is a brighter deep blue. So it's kind of in between. Now, these things vary with lighting, and you really want to consider that with bluebirds. When they're backlit, they really look a lot darker, as do all birds, but something special to consider. And the brightness of blue is going to depend on the nature of your lighting and sunlight versus clouds and lighting angle and all of that. So looking at the mountain bluebird, we have sky blue. It's basically all blue. So it's pretty straightforward to ID a male mountain bluebird. Notice it's white down here on the lower belly, undertail covert area. All right, so we go to the western bluebird, and it's got blue all over the top of its head, including the side of its neck. See this grayer area here? These are the auriculars, right? The ear coverts, and they're a particular feather track, and we're interested in this area below the ear coverts. That's the side of the neck, blue on the western bluebird. And underneath, he is kind of not white, right? He's a little bit bluish tinged down there. So that's an important feature. And we can see peeking out on the back, there's a rusty back, and we'll see the upper parts on some other slides later. Now let's compare to the eastern bluebird over here. We see that he is not blue on the throat, and he's got orange coming up here beneath the auriculars. So where this western is blue, the eastern bluebird is orange. Okay, this is not the side of the neck. This is actually the side of the breast down here. So it's a little lower. So we're interested in this area a little higher up. And notice that the belly down here is nice, clean white on the eastern bluebird versus that bluish, grayish tinge on the western. And on the western, it kind of blends here, but on the eastern, it's much more sharp, clean demarcation underneath. So those are our basics, and we can see them played out in these different bluebirds here. We can also begin to consider shape. The mountain bluebird is a little longer and larger than the others, proportionally has a smaller head than the others. The eastern bluebird is the smallest of the bunch. So slimmer build, larger size in the mountain, medium size, more compact in the western, and smaller and often plump looking in the eastern bluebird. These kind of things depend a little bit on what the birds are doing. You can also appreciate their bill shapes. The mountain bluebird has a narrow, thinner, longer bill. The other two have a thicker, shorter bill. All right. So now look a little bit more at the upper parts here. Notice a few different things I'd like to point out in these slides. First, we can appreciate those same color differences I was pointing out, and that the upper parts of the mountain bluebird are a darker blue than the under parts. And we can notice that he is actually dusky out here on the wingtips and things. So he's not blue everywhere, but there are some dark areas. The wings are actually nearly entirely blue, but the tips are dusky on the mountain bluebird. We can also see a feature that we can look at. Sometimes we talk about the primary projection, and this is a good feature on bluebirds. And the primary projection is how far the longest primary projects from the tertials. Okay, so here's the tertial ending here. Here's the primary sticking out. I'm skipping the secondaries as I look at this eastern bluebird on the right. This is a primary projection. It's a little bit shortish compared to this mountain bluebird. Here's the longest tertial. Here's the primaries going way out. They have very long wings. So that's, you know, if you look at these two pictures and you say, oh my goodness, it's not hard to tell them apart. But imagine poor lighting, imagine a distance, imagine they're not adult males. That can be a feature that could be useful even maybe in a photograph or a scope view. All right, so some more blues. You notice how the lighting in the left-hand picture plays a big impact on the different tones of blue, and also the very rich looking blue in this western bluebird in the middle compared to some of the other images we've seen. Notice that he is blue here underneath the coverts and not quite white on the undertail coverts here versus white on this eastern bluebird, which is a little more subdued plumage here on this one because of the time of year. All right, so beautiful backs. So a big feature for the western bluebird is that it has a rusty back. Now it varies. Sometimes it's the whole area here we could call the mantle, and sometimes it's more limited, and sometimes it's kind of lacking. Occasionally the eastern bluebird will have some color there, but it's pretty rare, so let's not sweat that too much. The mountain bluebird doesn't have any chestnut or orange color anywhere on the male. So let's look at the colors there on those boys. So you know what? So I've been saying about the seasonal color change, and here we see some great examples of it. So right now, the mountain bluebirds that we see coming into Colorado that we're going to enjoy as we get into the nesting season are at their brightest. Okay, so they are really bright, but after they molt, they are not so bright. So notice the left-hand side here, bright blues in the spring, subdued blues in the fall. So it happens that bluebirds have a complete pre-basic molt on their summer breeding grounds. So that means that after these bluebirds are done nesting, they molt all of their feathers. And at that time, there are brownish gray tips on the fresh feathers that are concealing the bright blue, and those are going to wear off by the time spring comes around to become bright blue. So these aren't necessarily young bluebirds over here. These are, see the grayish feathers on the wings here, on the back, along the side of the neck, up in the crown, on the breast. These are all these feather tips that are going to wear off to reveal a bright blue. Now, sometimes the birds look kind of frosty, and when you get that impression, I know I'm looking at a fall bird. Frosty equals fall. All right, but they're beautiful no matter what, but they're most beautiful in terms of the brightness at this time of year and getting into the nesting season. So the boys are blue, but the girls are gray. The girls are basically grayish versions of the male bluebird. It's more extreme in the mountain bluebird, which can look quite grayish or sometimes kind of brownish without any much color, except you'll notice that the females still have blue in their wings, tail, and rump. And that's going to be consistent. This is a male on the left here, female on the right, male on the left, female on the right for the western and eastern. We just have the female mountain showing in this picture. So she's very gray, and there's really not any contrast between her head and her back. Generally on the mountain bluebird, there's a no contrast zone there. This is usually ashy gray. It could be a warmer color in the fall. There's a lot of different things going on. We're not going to worry about that too much. Notice it's white down here. This female, notice it is a little more blended like the male western was. And she is grayish here and we can't really appreciate too much on this female. So we're going to go on and take a look at these other pictures, and we can see that these same features we're looking at on the adult males are some things we can apply on the females as well. An important feature is to look at the side of the neck when you're dealing with the Western and the Eastern, which is really a concern mostly along the Front Range general region, down in the lowlands where Eastern can overlap with the Western a little bit in some local areas. Otherwise, you don't have to deal with the question a whole lot, but it's one to be concerned about. Notice this is a brighter white on her underparts here, and this is a more muted grayish, even bluish toned to some degree pattern down there. Okay, so a few more females here. A lot of times the females have an eye-ringed effect, and they may look like they have a malar line, which I don't see too much on these images, or a white line going across the lores. That's a characteristic of a lot of female bluebirds. They do have a lot of blue in the wings if you get the wings open, and sometimes it can be blue all over the wing coverts as well. Whoops. Back up, don't want to go too fast. So here's a good example on the left of a mountain bluebird that's not quite so gray, has a little more color tone. And if we look at these two, Western and Eastern here, again, we can try to apply, what do we see below the auriculars here? Is it gray or is it orange? It looks kind of grayish, bluish to me, but here in that area, I see it's kind of orangey toned. All right, and a little whiter here, a little more bluish tone, a little more subtle in those pictures. Good image of eye-ringed effect and the laurel line, and sometimes a malar line, this dark line coming down from the bill. You can also appreciate the shapes of the bills in these pictures, which could be useful for identifying females. Notice the lack of contrast on this mountain bluebird, just gray. All right, so little ladies review. We've just been picking up on some of that with those last pictures. But let's notice slim and trim for the mountain on the left and a bit rotund over there in the east. And the mountain with the longer, thinner bill and the shorter, thicker bills on these other two. And the mountain is generally gray to brown underneath. The others have orange tones with a contrast with a white upper belly, with a clear demarcation on the Eastern bluebird on the right and a blended transition and not so white on the Western bluebird. So birds are just coming in, but they're coming in because they want to have families. They want to make more bluebirds, and they're going to be looking for their bluebird habitat that we talked about, finding their cavities and nest boxes, and they're going to be laying eggs and rearing young. Now, when the young bluebirds come out, they don't look like the adults at all, except for their shape. And they're going to be with the adults, but they are spotted and they are gray. So there's very little blue going on in these juveniles. So we're going to call these juveniles or fledglings. This is how they look when they're out of the nest for their first several weeks. And the contrast of the spots or kind of streaky effect fades, but you can tell them very easily, and they're often begging. And you can figure out which species they are pretty much by association with which adults are around, and sometimes habitat and so on. It can make it obvious as well. So they're hard to identify otherwise, but you can see the shape differences are still there that we've been learning about. So the recent fledglings are in family groups. They're tended by the parents when you see them in the spotted plumage, and that's like late June to late July. That's the main time for this. And they have the spotted breast, the sides, and back. So I don't have any backs showing in these pictures much. A few spots maybe on the lower right bird there. The spots on the back tend to wear off faster and can be a little less marked. And the birds are generally grayish overall. Now, several weeks after nesting, they're going to molt, a preformative molt, and then they're going to look like adults, just like duller versions of adults. You know, life's not always easy for a baby bluebird. They're not always just happy and getting fed by the adults. Sometimes you got this big, mean Eastern kingbirds to deal with, or other things that are nasty. And this little Eastern bluebird here is fending off this interloping Eastern kingbird. I just love the both bills open and the distress on the right-hand bird. All right, so we're coming to the end of the nesting season here, and the adults get worn out. Their plumage gets worn, and the birds start to look ratty. Even our beautiful Western bluebirds look ratty. all three species. And so they're going to molt. They have a complete pre-basic molt after the nesting season, or as it concludes, and then for the short time afterwards. Basically, we're talking about August and September is the time when they're molting. We have some mountain bluebirds here, and they go look ratty, they look unkempt, and they look splotchy with pale splotches. These are not young bluebirds molting to adult plumage. These are adult bluebirds molting, and they have these various messy looks to them. We don't see them so much in this plumage. They seem to make themselves a little less obvious during this molting time. They are molting their flight feathers. Like some birds can be a little less mobile and so on. So, but we have this messy time during the summer, and then it's all going to be nice and sweet. So now we have, it's time to do a little review here, and we're going to have a little quiz. We got 3 or 4 quiz slides. And I'm giving away the first one. It's east versus west. So we're going to chop out the mountain bluebird right away. And I think I'm beginning with something kind of easy for you. So I know I've been hard in the bird bombs in the past, but this one, what do we got? We've got clearly a male bluebird, and we see that its whole head is blue, including the throat area and the side of the neck. And the belly area is kind of off-white. Not a clean white, and there's kind of a blended thing going on here. So those are things that catch my eye, but I think you knew right away that this was a Western bluebird. And so let's consider this one on the right here, which I think I should have had you look at that picture first. All right, but we can compare and contrast and use this as a little review leading to our next pictures. Again, looking at the sides of the neck and the whiter underparts here versus grayish bluish. And a little bit of a cleaner demarcation there. That bird's not the cleanest as far as they go. All right, so Eastern, yeah. Got ahead of myself. So now I'm not going to do that again, but there's a summary of what I was just sharing. So here we have 3, straight on quiz. My first question for you is, what kind of plant is the bird perched in picture number 5? It's an important plant for bluebirds in Colorado in some areas at some times of the year, and that is a Russian olive. It's also very popular for a lot of other fruit-eating birds, other thrushes as well, like robins and Townsend solitaire. So we got 3 bluebirds across the lower part here, 3, 4, and 5. What do you think? If we look at the features we want to see, side of the neck, color of the belly area, the nature of the transition between the pale and the orange, and I think we have an Eastern, a Western, and an Eastern. All right. So those are East meets West. Now, these pictures on this slide are all images that were listed as Bluebird Spa on eBird. All right. So the contributor didn't identify their image. They just put it in Bluebird Spa. And I thought that would be fun. Let's look at those and see what we can do. So I just picked some. And first image we have here is some birds up in a juniper. Okay, that's kind of interesting. That tells us probably that we're maybe up in the foothills or something like that, or maybe west. And we can also see that these birds have, I'm looking for some that are more strongly marked. And this one on the lower right looks like a very blue head and pretty orangey under here. I don't see a whole lot of white contrasting strongly on any of these bellies. This one in the center, you can see the belly real well. And it looks kind of like it's pale there, but it's not a sharply contrasting white or anything. So those kind of things are going to lead me to conclude, and you, I hope, Western. Now take a look at these guys. These guys arrayed along a fence line here. We see some are more brownish and some are bluish and generally grayish. All right, so because we don't have a lot of orange on the underparts of these guys here, which we think are males because they do have blue up here, right? We're going to go with what you all know, Mountain Bluebird, right? And now my question though is, what time of year do you think this picture was taken? Notice the grayish cast on these males here. This is a picture that was taken in fall. All right, so this is taken October, actually, October 7th, Clear Creek. So Mountain Bluebird. All right, so what about this bird? Got some orangey underneath. I don't see a lot of white on the undertail area there, and can't see anything about its face because it's got its head turned away. Well, you know what? I guess I have to, is this a bluebird? Maybe you weren't fooled. Hope you weren't. But look, we see features here that are not bluebird-like, right? It's got a black tail. There's no white down here on the undertail coverts, and there really isn't any blue. It kind of looks blue cast, but it's in the shade. Uh-oh, says Phoebe, not a bluebird spa. Okay, so this one though, here we see some blue. So this is a little more hopeful. At least it's probably a bluebird. And we see gray and blue and no contrast between the head and the back. Not a great image, but I think we could say what? Mountain bluebird. All right. So here's an image. This one I think is a little more challenging. So let's consider a few different things. First, I want to invite you to look at, do you think it's a mountain bluebird? The blue is not especially bright, not that sky blue, and the bill shape is not especially good for a mountain bluebird, right? It's a little thicker and shorter, not so skinny looking. And we won't worry about anything else about that. But what about so we can kind of eliminate the mountain bluebird. Also, the primary projection looks a little bit more on the short side. But what else can we say? So then that would leave us with a Western or an Eastern based on shape and some color features there. And I don't see any orange coming up on here. So I'd have to go probably with a Western bluebird. Indeed, this picture was taken on the coast of California. And interestingly, I think California is probably the only state in the contiguous US states that has not had an Eastern bluebird recorded. So that's one that Colorado has up on California, probably really overdue there. So Western bluebird. So how about this bird? Got spotted breast, must be a juvenile that's kind of brownish grayish, could be one of those spotty juveniles, but wait a minute, it has no blue anywhere. Even on the tail, no blue, and the bill kind of looks weird, and it's very brown. Yeah, this is a hermit thrush, so not a bluebird spot. All right, so a little quick review of some bird parts. So I'm just going to let you visualize these things here, and then we'll put up the answers. So looking for primaries, secondaries, and tertials, 1, 2, and 3. And then if you're seeing those, you can probably figure out where the scapulars are, and maybe even the greater secondary coverts and the primary covert. So here we go. So we've got primaries 1, secondaries 2, tertials 3, scapulars overlaying those feathers somewhat and overlaying these greater secondary coverts. And here's the primary coverts over here. The primary coverts are over the primaries, and the secondary coverts are over the secondaries. All right. So what family are bluebirds in? Turdidae, you got it. And it's best to throw that Latin name in there and don't just say the thrush family, and certainly not the bluebird family. What genus are bluebirds in? Do you remember? And to pronounce it, Cyalia. Cyalia. All right. So here's our last chance. What do you think here? Take it all in. Shape, pattern, color. It's spotted, but it doesn't look right. Indeed, this is not a bluebird, but a juvenile Townsend solitaire. But hey, that's in the same family, and they're spotted just like bluebirds. I was going to throw that in. Beautiful bird, and think about it in the bluebird context. So thanks very much to the photographers who contributed to this bird bombs and to all the bird bombs that I do. More than 24 photographers whose images were used in this presentation. The images are credited on each slide, I hope correctly. I want to give a special shout out to Joanne Potter-Riggle, who contributed many of the bluebird images, or I took from her eBird contributions. She's got a lot of bluebirds, so thank you, Joanne. And thank you to everybody. Don't forget, vote Bluebird. And you can view past bird bombs on the DFO page. Go to programs and events and scroll down to past programs. That's where they are right now. And this one will be up. You can review it and study up again, or check out some parts again. Should be up in a couple days on the DFO page. Now, the next bird bombs is coming up in just a month, April 13th. It will be spring swallows. So spring is really here. when the swallows are in, because then we know it's also going to be some green around here. Right now, we've got the bluebirds, we got spring, but no green yet. So take a look at this beautiful bluebird on the right-hand part of this image here. So this is a juvenile, right? Beautiful, fresh juvenile with a nice spotted back. I didn't label it there. See if you can figure out which one it is based on just its shape, maybe. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to stop screen sharing and we'll go to a little Q&A.
Hey, thanks, David. That was great. So let's see, Jan says, fantastic presentation as usual. Thanks for all the work that you put into these. I think we all agree. My first question for you is, it seems that the Eastern Bluebird, based on the eBird graphs, you could almost kind of think of it as a wintering species in the Front Range.
Right.
And I know that we have some other species, like swamp sparrows seems to kind of be a wintering sparrow that leaves for spring, summer, fall. Any thoughts as to why? Why does the Eastern Bluebird seem to show up here in the winter?
That's a good question. And I think that since we're talking about Eastern Bluebirds, that was the answer to that juvenile bluebird on my last slide there. That was an Eastern, beautiful picture. But so that's a good question. One thing that strikes me is that during that time of year, there is a fair amount of food available for bluebirds, that they're primarily outside of their breeding range along the Front Range. Now, there are some breeding records along there, so we have to consider that they do occur regularly in the nesting season locally, and that can vary over the years. So it's not totally unheard of, but for the most part, it's a non-breeding season presence. And it could be that there's a time of dispersal that happens after nesting that takes them away from their breeding range. And also they encounter good food resources along the Front Range with the Russian olives that are planted in a lot of areas, and other things, as we've seen with our waxwing invasion, a lot of different fruiting things that could attract bluebirds as well.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. Deb Carson asks, what does pre-basic molt mean?
So the good thing is that I think it's in July, that Bird Bombs is going to be on molt, and we'll tell all then. But basically, we think about the basic plumage as the plumage the bird is in during its non-breeding time. Now, some birds retain that same plumage all the way through their breeding time, like the bluebirds do. They molt after the nesting season. Now pretty much everything has a complete molt after the breeding season. So I'm just going to throw that out there, that most of our birds have complete molts at that time, and they lead into what's called a basic plumage. That's the formal name of the plumage. So the molt that gets there is the pre-basic molt, and it happens after the nesting season. There's also in some birds a pre-alternate molt, like with the yellow rump warblers, they go from a dull non-breeding plumage to a bright breeding plumage, and that happens in the early spring. And so we'll see when they start coming in, some of them are molting at that time. And so that's a pre-alternate molt. In the case of the bluebirds, they just have the one molt at the conclusion of the breeding season.
Interesting. Yeah, cool. Thanks. It's like a complicated process. So I'm excited for that July.
It is confusing. It's all about changing your clothes, really, is what it's about. And what accessories you change and what you retain.
Oh boy, I can't wait for that presentation now. Cool. One more question for you. Again, if you do have a question for David, please pop it into the Q&A. I'm watching that. But one more question for you is, we talked about how the bluebirds have slightly different habitats, different parts of the state to be looking out for, different ones, and that they look different. Do they sound different?
They do, and I haven't focused much on sounds with bird bombs, but the bluebird calls, they don't have like a long melodious song or anything like a lot of others. So it's a much more subtle, chirpy kinds of things, little fluted notes, and you hear them a lot when they're flying over, and they do call when they're perched, but they do sound different. But I think it takes a trained ear
Sure.
that's had exposure to them to really be able to recognize them. I think it's a little bit subtle, but you can listen to them on your Merlin app or whichever, and you'll hear that they are different. And Merlin will probably help you identify some of them, but it is a subtle distinction.
Cool. Oh, sweet. We got a couple of more questions.
Okay.
Ron asks, do bluebirds only nest in families? He mentions that he's put up a single nest box next to the foothills. He's hoping to get mountain bluebirds.
So what is the question now? Can you
so when bluebirds are nesting, and we're thinking about nesting boxes, do the bluebirds kind of only nest in family groups?
Oh yeah, you're going to have one pair around a box, and generally you put boxes so they're not too close to each other. If you want them to be used effectively, because the birds compete. Bluebirds in our area compete with tree swallows for nest boxes, to some degree with violet green swallow, but the tree likes that same kind of open grassy setting. Violet green's often more in trees or in a forest woodland kind of setting, or in rocks up on cliffs, but the trees and the mountain bluebirds overlap a lot. Also the western, so there's with the swallows and the bluebirds kind of duke it out, and our bluebirds are getting here a little ahead of the swallows. And sometimes you see that when the swallows come in, they will be disputing boxes with bluebirds, so because they got to get what they can get.
Yeah, I feel like I've read that if you put two nest boxes right together, that the swallows and the bluebirds each have kind of like a range that they won't put. Two tree swallows won't put their nests too close to each other. So if you put two nest boxes right next to each other, you'll have angry neighbors, but you might get both.
Yeah. Well, that would be fun to be able to experiment with that in my big backyard, with all these nesting bluebirds, house wren swallows, all this bounty. But I don't have that. But yeah, and there are a lot of places in the mountains, Park County, which I'm very familiar with, especially where there's a lot of bluebird boxes that have been put out, and there's a great opportunity for mountain bluebirds. They're not all being used. There's more boxes than there are bluebirds often, and they do have ups and downs in their population. We had apparently a big impact on our bluebird populations in 2020 with well, I guess it was, and I'm getting somewhere in that period, we had a lot of fires that impacted migrants, and then we had a really cold spell in February in their wintering grounds, and the next year we didn't have very many bluebirds around. It was 2 breeding seasons ago, and last year was a little better, but so hopefully this year we'll have a lot.
Cool. Let's see. Linda asks, can you explain how the structure of the feather allows for the blue color? We've got a couple of questions about that, actually, about the color and the structure.
So just to put it very simply, the light is being refracted by the structure of the feather, kind of in a prism-like effect, and some light's being canceled out and others coming back to our eye, and so we're just seeing that particular color versus it being created by a pigment. So it's a refracting kind of a thing, and I can't go into further detail on that right now. But you can find out a lot about that if you Google it. You'll find a more erudite and interesting explanation than I just gave. But basically, that's the nutshell of it.